Part One, Section 2 of The Maine Woods by Henry David Thoreau. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part One, Ktaadn, Section 2. About noon we reached the Mattawamkeag, 56 miles from Bangor by the way we had come, and put up at a frequented house still on the Houlton road, where the Houlton stage stops. Here was a substantial covered bridge over the Mattawamkeag, built, I think they said, some 17 years before. We had dinner, where, by the way, and even at breakfast, as well as supper, at the public houses on this road, the front rank is composed by various kinds of sweet cakes, in a continuous line from one end of the table to the other. I think I may safely say that there was a row of 10 or a dozen plates of this kind set before us two here. To account for which, they say that, when the lumberers come out of the woods, they have a craving for cakes and pies, and such sweet things, which there are almost unknown, and this is the supply to satisfy that demand. The supply is always equal to the demand, and these hungry men think a good deal of getting their money's worth. No doubt the balance of victuals is restored by the time they reach Bangor. Mattawamkeag takes off the raw edge. Well, over this front rank, I say, you, coming from the sweet cake side, with a cheap philosophic indifference though it may be, have to assault what there is behind, which I do not by any means mean to insinuate is insufficient in quantity or quality to supply that other demand of men, not from the woods but from the towns, for venison and strong country fare. After dinner we strolled down to the point, formed by the junction of the two rivers, which is said to be the scene of an ancient battle between the Eastern Indians and the Mohawks, and searched there carefully for relics, though the men at the bar room had never heard of such things; but we found only some flakes of arrowhead stone, some points of arrowheads, one small leaden bullet, and some colored beads, the last to be referred perhaps to early fur trader days. The Mattawamkeag, though wide, was a mere river's bed, full of rocks and shallows at this time, so that you could cross it almost dry shod in boots, and I could hardly believe my companion when he told me that he had been 50 or 60 miles up it in a batteau, through distant and still uncut forests. A batteau could hardly find a harbor now at its mouth. Deer and caribou, or reindeer, are taken here in the winter in sight of the house. Before our companions arrived, we rode on up the Houlton road 7 miles to Molunkus, where the Aroostook road comes into it, and where there is a spacious public house in the woods, called the Molunkus House, kept by one Libby, which looked as if it had its hall for dancing and for military drills. There was no other evidence of man but this huge shingle palace in this part of the world, but sometimes even this is filled with travelers. I looked off the piazza round the corner of the house up the Aroostook road, on which there was no clearing in sight. There was a man just adventuring upon it this evening, in a rude, original, what you may call Aroostook wagon, a mere seat, with a wagon swung under it, a few bags on it, and a dog asleep to watch them. He offered to carry a message for us to anybody in that country, cheerfully. I suspect that, if you should go to the end of the world, you would find somebody there going farther, as if just starting for home at sundown, and having a last word before he drove off. Here, too, was a small trader, whom I did not see at first, who kept a store, but no great store, certainly, in a small box over the way behind the Molunkus sign-post. It looked like the balance box of a patent hay scales. As for his house, we could only conjecture where that was. He may have been a boarder in the Molunkus house. I saw him standing in his shop door. His shop was so small that if a traveler should make demonstration of entering in, he would have to go out by the back way and confer with his customer through a window about his goods in the cellar, or, more probably, be spoken and yet on the way. I should have gone in, for I felt a real impulse to trade, if I had not stopped to consider what would become of him. The day before, we had walked into a shop, over against an inn where we stopped, the puny beginning of trade, which would grow at last into a firm copartnership in the future town or city. Indeed, it was already Somebody and Co., I forget who. The woman came forward from the penetralia of the attached house, for Somebody and Company was in the burning, and she sold us percussion caps, canales and smooth, and knew their prices and qualities, and which the hunters preferred. Here was a little of everything in a small compass to satisfy the wants and the ambition of the woods, a stock selected with what pains and care, and brought home in the wagon box, or a corner of the Houlton team. But there seemed to me, as usual, a preponderance of children's toys, dogs to bark and cats to mew and trumpets to blow, where natives there hardly are yet. As if a child born into the Maine woods, among the pine cones and cedar berries, could not do without such a sugar man or skipping jack as the young Rothschild has. I think that there was not more than one house on the road to Molunkus, or for 7 miles. At that place we got over the fence into a new field, planted with potatoes, where the logs were still burning between the hills, and, pulling up the vines, found good-sized potatoes nearly ripe, growing like weeds, and turnips mixed with them. The mode of clearing and planting is to fell the trees, and burn once what will burn, then cut them up into suitable lengths, roll into heaps, and burn again. Then, with a hoe, plant potatoes where you can come at the ground between the stumps and charred logs. For a first crop, the ashes sufficing for manure, and no hoeing being necessary the first year. In the fall, cut, roll, and burn again, and so on, till the land is cleared, and soon it is ready for grain and to be laid down. Let those talk of poverty and hard times who will in the towns and cities; cannot the emigrant who can pay his fare to New York or Boston pay $5 more to get here? I paid 3, all told, for my passage from Boston to Bangor, 250 miles, and be as rich as he pleases, where land virtually costs nothing, and houses only the labor of building, and he may begin life as Adam did. If he will still remember the distinction of poor and rich, let him bespeak him a narrower house forthwith. When we returned to the Mattawamkeag, the Houlton stage had already put up there, and a Province man was betraying his greenness to the Yankees by his questions. Why Province money won't pass here at par, when States money is good at Fredericton, though this, perhaps, was sensible enough. From what I saw then, it appears that the Province man was now the only real Jonathan, or raw country bumpkin, left so far behind by his enterprising neighbors that he didn't know enough to put a question to them. No people can long continue provincial in character who have the propensity for politics and whittling, and rapid traveling, which the Yankees have, and who are leaving the mother country behind in the variety of their notions and inventions. The possession and exercise of practical talent, merely, are a sure and rapid means of intellectual culture and independence. The last edition of Greenleaf's Map of Maine hung on the wall here, and as we had no pocket map, we resolved to trace a map of the lake country. So, dipping a wad of tow into the lamp, we oiled a sheet of paper on the oiled tablecloth, and, in good faith, traced what we afterwards ascertained to be a labyrinth of errors, carefully following the outlines of the imaginary lakes which the map contains. The map of the public lands of Maine and Massachusetts is the only one I have seen that at all deserves the name. It was while we were engaged in this operation that our companions arrived. They had seen the Indians fire on the 5 islands, and so we concluded that all was right. Early the next morning we had mounted our packs, and prepared for a tramp up the West Branch, my companion having turned his horse out to pasture for a week or 10 days, thinking that a bite of fresh grass and a taste of running water would do him as much good as backwoods fare and new country influences his master. Leaping over a fence, we began to follow an obscure trail up the northern bank of the Penobscot. There was now no road further, the river being the only highway, and but a half dozen log huts confined to its banks to be met with for 30 miles. On either hand and beyond was a wholly uninhabited wilderness stretching to Canada. Neither horse nor cow nor vehicle of any kind had ever passed over this ground, the cattle and the few bulky articles which the loggers use being got up in the winter on the ice, and down again before it breaks up. The evergreen woods had a decidedly sweet and bracing fragrance. The air was a sort of diet drink. and we walked on buoyantly in Indian file, stretching our legs. Occasionally there was a small opening on the bank, made for the purpose of log rolling, where we got a sight of the river, always a rocky and rippling stream. The roar of the rapids, the note of a whistler duck on the river, of the jay and chickadee around us, and of the pigeon woodpecker in the openings, were the sounds that we heard. This was what you might call a brand new country. The only roads were of nature's making, and the few houses were camps. Here, then, one could no longer accuse institutions and society, but must front the true source of evil. There are three classes of inhabitants who either frequent or inhabit the country which we had now entered. First, the loggers, who for a part of the year, the winter and spring, are far the most numerous, but in the summer, except a few explorers for timber, completely desert it. Second, the few settlers I have named, the only permanent inhabitants, who live on the verge of it, and help raise supplies for the former. Third, the hunters, mostly Indian, who range over it in their season. At the end of 3 miles we came to the Mattaseunk stream and mill, where there was even a rude wooden railroad running down to the Penobscot, the last railroad we were to see. We crossed one tract on the bank of the river, of more than 100 acres of heavy timber, which had just been felled and burnt over, and was still smoking. Our trail lay through the midst of it, and was well nigh blotted out. The trees lay at full length, 4 or 5 feet deep, and crossing each other in all directions, all black as charcoal, but perfectly sound within, still good for fuel or for timber. Soon they would be cut into lengths and burnt again. Here were thousands of cords, enough to keep the poor of Boston and New York amply warm for a winter, which only cumbered the ground and were in the settlers' way. And the whole of that solid and interminable forest is doomed to be gradually devoured thus by fire, like shavings, and no man to be warmed by it. At Crocker's log hut at the mouth of Salmon River, 7 miles from the point, one of the party commenced distributing a store of small cent picture books among the children, to teach them to read, and also newspapers, more or less recent, among the parents, than which nothing can be more acceptable to a backwoods people. It was really an important item in our outfit, and at times the only currency that would circulate. I walked through Salmon River with my shoes on, it being low water, but not without wetting my feet. A few miles farther we came to Marm Howard's, at the end of an extensive clearing, where there were 2 or 3 log huts in sight at once, one on the opposite side of the river, and a few graves even, surrounded by a wooden paling, where already the rude forefathers of a hamlet lie, and 1,000 years hence, perchance, some poet will write his elegy in a country churchyard. The village Hampdens, the mute, inglorious Miltons and Cromwells, guiltless of their country's blood, were yet unborn. Perchance in this wild spot there will be laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. The next house was Fisk's, 10 miles from the point at the mouth of the East Branch, opposite to the island Nicketow, or the Forks, the last of the Indian islands. I am particular to give the names of the settlers and the distances, since every log hut in these woods is a public house, and such information is of no little consequence to those who may have occasion to travel this way. Our course here crossed the Penobscot and followed the southern bank. One of the party, who entered the house in search of some one to set us over, reported a very neat dwelling, with plenty of books and a new wife, just imported from Boston, wholly new to the woods. We found the East Branch, a large and rapid stream, at its mouth, and much deeper than it appeared. Having with some difficulty discovered the trail again, we kept up the south side of the West Branch, or main river, passing by some rapids called Rock Ebeem, the roar of which we heard through the woods, and, shortly after, in the thickest of the woods, some empty loggers' camps, still new, which were occupied the previous winter. Though we saw a few more afterward, I will make one account serve for all. These were such houses as the lumberers of Maine spend the winter in the wilderness. There were the camps and the hovels for the cattle, hardly distinguishable, except that the latter had no chimney. These camps were about 20 feet long by 15 wide, built of logs, hemlock, cedar, spruce, or yellow birch, one kind alone or all together, with the bark on; two or three large ones first, one directly above another and notched together at the ends to the height of 3 or 4 feet, then of smaller logs resting upon transverse ones at the end, each of the last successively shorter than the other, to form the roof. The chimney was an oblong square hole in the middle, 3 or 4 feet in diameter, with a fence of logs as high as the ridge. The interstices were filled with moss, and the roof was shingled with long and handsome splints of cedar, or spruce, or pine, rifted with a sledge and cleaver. The fireplace, the most important place of all, was in shape and size like the chimney, and directly under it, defined by a log fence or fender on the ground, and a heap of ashes, a foot or two deep within, with solid benches of split logs running round it. Here the fire usually melts the snow and dries the rain before it can descend to quench it. The faded beds of arbor vitæ leaves extended under the eaves on either hand. There was the place for the water pail, pork barrel, and wash basin, and generally a dingy pack of cards left on a log. Usually a good deal of whittling was expended on the latch, which was made of wood, in the form of an iron one. These houses are made comfortable by the huge fires which can be afforded night and day. Usually the scenery about them is drear and savage enough, and the loggers' camp is as completely in the woods as a fungus at the foot of a pine in a swamp. No outlook but to the sky overhead, no more clearing than is made by cutting down the trees of which it is built, and those which are necessary for fuel. If only it be well sheltered and convenient to his work, and near a spring, he wastes no thought on the prospect. They are very proper forest houses, the stems of the trees collected together and piled up around a man to keep out wind and rain, made of living green logs, hanging with moss and lichen, and with the curls and fringes of the yellow birch bark, and dripping with rosin, fresh and moist, and redolent of swampy odors, with that sort of vigor and perennialness even about them that toadstools suggest. The loggers' fare consists of tea, molasses, flour, pork, sometimes beef, and beans. A great proportion of the beans raised in Massachusetts find their market here. On expeditions it is only hard bread and pork, often raw, slice upon slice, with tea or water, as the case may be. End of Part One, Section 2. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.